Under a grey winter sky, the last cables of the Reich Chancellery crackled with frantic orders. Hitler paced the dim map room, boots striking the marble like a metronome of dread. Reports arrived in bursts, radio chatter from the west, intercepted Allied messages, field dispatches carried by exhausted adjutants. Every line pointed to the same impossible conclusion: Patton had broken the line again. 7 panzer divisions, armor that Hitler once called the fist of Germany, had been shattered in 7 days. At first, Hitler refused to believe it. He demanded names of commanders, numbers of tanks, precise battlefield coordinates. He accused his generals of exaggeration, of pessimism, of defeatism bordering on treason. But the maps said otherwise. The great salient that was supposed to break the Americans had collapsed inward. Patton's Third Army had cut through roads that were meant to be impassable, through towns that should have taken days to defend, through weather that every German staff officer swore would ground the Allies indefinitely. Instead, the tanks came, Shermans growling through the fog, half-tracks clattering behind them, artillery barking in measured rhythm as if the guns themselves understood strategy. Hitler stopped at the edge of the map table and pressed both hands on the cold wood. Patton, he muttered, as if tasting the word. Not Eisenhower, not Bradley, not Montgomery, Patton. The American is reckless, he had once told Guderian. Reckless men win battles, but not wars. Now he wondered if he had underestimated how far recklessness could go when fuel and factories and fresh divisions stood behind it. Patton's pace baffled the German high command. Panzer units trained for maneuver warfare found themselves outmaneuvered in their own doctrine. Commanders complained that the American artillery fired faster than they could redeploy, that their reconnaissance planes appeared even in the worst snow, that the very roads seemed to bend in favor of Patton's columns. German tankers spoke in disbelief of how quickly the Third Army shifted east, then north, then east again, striking where the Wehrmacht expected delays. On the 4th day, Hitler summoned Model and Rundstedt by telephone. His voice, usually thunderous, was controlled and brittle, like a blade that would snap under pressure. "How many operational tanks remain in the 7th Panzer?" he demanded. Silence crackled in reply. "How many?" he roared. The number finally came, hesitant: fewer than 40. Hitler clenched his jaw. 40 tanks from a division that had fielded over 200 at the start of the counteroffensive. The 5th day brought worse news. The 9th Panzer had been cut off. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division was falling back without orders. SS formations on the flank reported that ammunition consumption exceeded projections by 300%. Hitler slammed his fist onto the table. "Where is the Luftwaffe?" he shouted. Göring was not present to defend himself. The Luftwaffe was in the air, briefly, but fog swallowed its efforts as quickly as the British and Americans rebuilt their smashed runways. By the 6th day, the crisis had become too large to hide. German radio stations played martial music instead of front reports. Newspapers printed anecdotes of valor rather than maps of progress. Hitler knew what that tactic meant. He had ordered it himself years earlier, when Stalingrad began its long agony. He paced again, turning sharply at each wall, muttering fragments of strategy. Patton bypasses strongpoints, does not pause to reorganize, takes risks no German commander would tolerate. He spoke as if explaining the world to an absent student, but the room listened in fearful silence. "He fights like Rommel," Hitler finally said, voice low and bitter. But Rommel had no America behind him. The aides exchanged glances. Permit yourself to compare enemies to your own heroes, and defeat ceases to be abstract. That same night, Hitler reviewed intercepted propaganda broadcasts. Patton had not spoken publicly, but reports of his speeches to troops circulated like wildfire: threats of annihilation, promises of relentless pursuit, crude jokes about drinking German blood for breakfast. Hitler read one line twice, then threw the leaflet aside. "He is a showman," Hitler said, "but the soldiers believe him. They believe victory follows him." He turned to Jodl. "Do the soldiers still believe it follows us?" Jodl did not answer. On the 7th day, the last intact Panzer Brigade attempted a counterattack near a crossroads village the Americans barely bothered to defend. The Germans drove in at dawn, engines rumbling through drifting smoke, machine guns spitting to keep infantry heads low. For a moment, it seemed they would punch a hole, until the woods behind them erupted in muzzle flashes. Patton had laid his trap before leaving the sector, anticipating exactly where desperation would drive the armor. Not a maneuver for a committee, but for a gambler. When the surviving tankers reported the rout, Hitler listened with eyes flat and distant. 7 divisions in 7 days, he repeated. So this is the end of maneuver. He sank into his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Americans learn faster than Russians, he said softly. Russians overwhelm. Americans adapt. His generals watched, unsure if he was announcing resignation or preparation. Then Hitler's tone shifted. Tell the divisions to withdraw behind the river line, he said. Not retreat, withdraw for regrouping. The distinction meant nothing on the battlefield, but it mattered to him. Words could postpone reality, if not change it. At noon, a courier brought interrogation notes from captured American scouts. Hitler read them with unnerving interest. Patton had reportedly told officers that the goal was not merely to shatter the German line, it was to break the German will to maneuver. Once the panzers stopped moving, Patton had said, they're just steel coffins waiting for artillery. Hitler read the line again and murmured, he understands Blitzkrieg better than most of my generals. In the afternoon, Hitler demanded fuel estimates, not for the Wehrmacht, but for the U.S. Third Army. He asked about logistics, Allied petroleum shipments, port capacity at Antwerp, weather over the Channel, how quickly American tank factories could replace losses. He asked questions of an economist, not a field marshal. The staff sensed a shift. Hitler was no longer trying to win. He was trying to understand how defeat had become inevitable. If we had destroyed Antwerp sooner, he whispered, Patton would be crawling on his belly for gasoline. He paused. Everything is fuel in this war. Steel without fuel is scrap. He glanced at Speer, who stood rigid and pale. You told me we could compensate through miracle weapons. You told me the V-rockets would terrify England into negotiation. You promised the Tiger would dominate the battlefield. But none of it produced fuel. Speer opened his mouth, but Hitler waved him off, turning again to the map. 7 divisions, he repeated once more, as if the number contained some metaphysical lesson. Napoleon had his Marat. Who was Patton to Eisenhower? The executioner, or the spearhead? He let the question linger. No army wins a war without men like that. I thought America was too cautious, too bureaucratic. He shook his head. I see now I was wrong. The staff waited for orders. They expected another rant about betrayal or fate or the incompetence of subordinates. Instead, Hitler looked strangely calm, even reflective. History honors boldness, he said. Blitzkrieg succeeded because we dared what others would not. Patton now dares what our generals fear. He gives no pause. He accepts loss. He forces events. He stared directly at Jodl. Our generals wait for conditions. He creates them. Evening descended over Berlin like a drawn curtain. Lights were dimmed to avoid Allied bombers, and the corridors of the Chancellery echoed with distant footsteps and the occasional rustle of papers. Hitler returned to the map room one last time. He studied the lines marking the Western Front, then the Eastern Front, where the Red Army gathered for its final lunge toward the Oder. Between the two crept a narrowing zone of German land and diminishing time. Patton has accelerated the end, Hitler said quietly. It was not praise, but it was something close to acknowledgement. A week, he murmured. 7 days to break what I spent 7 years building. He brushed his hand across the map, smearing chalk symbols that represented divisions already dead. War had finally outpaced his imagination. And as the teleprinters clicked and couriers hurried past with new reports of withdrawals, surrenders, missing battalions, and ruined panzer hulls abandoned in ditches, Hitler muttered the words that no one dared repeat outside that room, he has beaten the Reich at its own war. But history would later reveal the epilogue. Patton did not hear Hitler's admission, nor would it have mattered. The Third Army continued forward, not for glory but for momentum, for the logic of victory that demands pursuit until the enemy ceases to exist as a coherent force. The shattered panzer divisions dissolved into fragments, men fleeing through the forests, officers burning orders in farmhouses, mechanics sabotaging their own vehicles to prevent capture. By the time spring arrived, Berlin would become a battleground of ruins, and Hitler's voice would fall silent beneath the earth. But in those 7 days, under that winter sky, in those desperate cables and whispered admissions, Hitler understood something no propaganda could conceal. Patton had not merely destroyed 7 Panzer divisions. He had destroyed the last German belief that the war could still be decided in maneuver. And in that realization, spoken to no one, admitted to the dim air of the Chancellery, lay the true end of Germany's dream of victory.